believe we're the last table, so I'm more standing in the way of you guys and whatever we have planned for the next piece of this. So from our table, we did prioritize 3 key items that really echo some of what most of you have been saying, but then we came up with some, unique suggestions and solutions that, South African government can consider when they go to the African Union. The top 3 things that we came up with, well, the very first one is around building local talent, as you've all pretty much mentioned. It's quite commonly said that in 6,000 days from now, Africa will have more than 1 billion people in the workforce, which will be the most anywhere in the world, right? So they need to get trained. The second most important piece we talked about was, engaging with the diaspora overseas, and we'll share with you some ideas on how we think that can be done. And then the last one is really around improving our reputation as a continent so we can attract more foreign investment and collaboration from the world. Now, diving a little deeper into these different pieces, the very, very most important one we thought was really the diaspora piece. I mean, if you think about the CEO of Tesla, where's he from? Okay, that's fantastic. Now, Sequoia Capital, which is arguably one of the most successful investment firms in the world, where's the CEO from? It's from South Africa as well, right? I can go on, and there are many other companies like that. And so, really, the best of our brains are abroad. They're in the US, they're in the UK, or parts of Europe, they're in Asia. So how can our government interact with these folks? You don't have to ask them to come home. We can work with them where they are. How about, we come up with a system whereby the lead of the AU every year spends 2 days in different locations meeting with the CEOs or some of these top professionals from the diaspora and working with them to build their economies. I mean, this is taking an example from India, where I'll ask questions again. Where is the CEO of Google and Microsoft? Where are they from? India. Exactly. And India has taken that as a step. The second one is we talk about proposing a declaration 2020 for digital economy, right? And that declaration that you should take to the African Union, it will have many things, but 2 of them worth looking at. The first one is, can there be a Pan-African digital platform for government? Right, shared across board. So we're not building solutions over and over again, but we're selecting some low-hanging fruits, for example, visa applications. Can we build one visa application system online such that when a foreign person is trying to go to Africa, there's one platform they use to apply? Like, imagine us being the first continent to do that. That's huge. That's going to change our reputation. We're going to be seen as a technology-enabled continent. That's huge, right? And moving from visas, we can move to business, registering a business, to getting a driver license, to whatever else you want to put on there. But we start from one point. And then the last piece there is on the education for digital economy and other spaces. Can we think about 2 things there? The first one is on the content. What should be the content of our education going forward? We need to revise that and stop teaching people how to code in Fortran, but think about data science and other education for the future. That's content, but even more revolutionary is the way to educate, is the places and the methods of education. Is it digital education on tablets, or is it rethinking how you teach? There's an institution in the Bay Area called, someone on our table mentioned the name 42. I don't know who knows about 42 here. Yes, so they're a school that doesn't teach. Well, okay, they teach you how to learn. There are no teachers in the school.
There's no graduation.
There's no graduation, there are no teachers in the school. You learn how to learn. And through that, you're finding people learning faster and actually pushing the boundaries of what they can actually learn. So with that, I'll close, and hopefully we can actually go ahead and implement some of these things in come 2020. Thank you.
What are the barriers to entry? Why is it that we can't do what it is that we envision, especially at an AU level? And we identified 3 key issues, being prioritization, coordination, and funding. And just to elaborate on those 3 issues, prioritization started with, the problem in Africa is that everyone is trying to do something, and a lot of efforts are being duplicated across different nations. So we're wasting funding and we're all trying to do the same thing. How can we identify what is important? So how can we create homegrown fourth industrial revolution solutions, something that's homegrown for African issues? The three key areas in Africa tends to be issues around education, health, and agriculture. How can we all focus to say Africa for the next 5 to 10 years, we're all going to focus on these three key issues, and which countries are going to focus on what solution? The second thing is around coordination, and some interesting solutions came around that. One gentleman on our table had an interesting concept on why the Silicon Valley works. And one of the points he brought up was because the Silicon Valley is built around universities. They're hotspots of education around that are driving the innovation. You know, research and development is here to support businesses to grow. So maybe we can be very strategic in our centers being around educational institutions for the research and development, so that the solutions are scientific, they're sound, and are optimized to work. He also spoke about, let us have hubs that specialize. If Southern Africa is good at something, let Southern Africa as a whole specialize in that area. If East Africa is good at something, let East Africa be responsible for specializing in that region. And that way, each area is given a chance to shine at what they're good at. And another thing that came from Kibone, which was good, she said, as much as we want everyone from Africa to come back home and build a great Africa, we'll always have Africans abroad. But how can we facilitate for highways of collaboration with the diaspora? How can we, as Africans that are out of Africa, also be able to add value and contribute to this movement? So that was something that was around coordination. And the last thing that came was around funding. And the gentleman who's from Stellenbosch said a big factor he had as a challenge was access to risk capital. It seems that in Africa, it's those that are already affluent that have access to building startups and innovating. So those that already have, continue to have, and those that don't get a chance. How can we create pools as government or as the business sector where it's people are incentivized to provide access to risk capital? So those were the three main areas. And what it came down to is how can we create an Ubuntu type of situation where as Africa we have an IP center maybe, where we say this is our center, this is our intellectual property, that is something that's missing. We spoke about a culture of keeping things to ourselves. We spoke about how here, when you meet someone says, I love your idea, I'm going to connect you to so-and-so, but back at home, even when you do have the resources to help someone, you don't. And that's something that's deep ingrained in our culture from maybe colonial times, that we maybe need to realize and start afresh. How can we, instead of holding back or pulling each other down, have a culture that is open to sharing what we have, and how can we create IP in our own continent? Because right now, apparently, the laws are quite restricted for scale. So some startups, once they sign their IPs, when they want to scale, they're restricted by laws, and then they move out. And then South Africa or Africa loses the idea, and they lose the investment that was in the idea. So our suggestion specifically to the governments and to the powers that be is let us lift barriers to scaling, especially our startups. You know, how can government bring better collaboration with the private sector? Does everything have to be around the government? Does everything have to be state-owned resources? How can we bring in the private sector so that we're working together, not against each other? How can our laws promote growth and inspire innovation? Are laws restricting, or are they inspiring innovation? And lastly, how can we educate investors on the right way to do business in Africa? I think for so long the narrative is 10%. When you're going to Africa, no, you need 10% per person to get to the way, and I think it's time that ends. Thank you.
So having more of a defensive versus an open policy around sort of privacy, and so just your own data privacy as well. So I think everyone has this very defensive approach towards data privacy. So maybe having a more open approach to that. Spectrum availability is another one. Communications and API standards, we've spoken a bit about that across many of the tables too. So just making sure there's some consistency across that throughout Africa. Policy alignment across Africa as well as even some of the global industries as well is very important for Africa to be successful The African passport, we didn't discuss that specifically, but I think it's a wonderful idea. And then the other key thing we thought around is around controlling value of their economy. So Africa as a continent, but also each of the economies themselves. So having some transparency around the Federal Reserve and how money is spent, funds flow, whether there's some technologies that you can trust, whether it's now or in the future around blockchain and enabling governments to be able to track the transparency of their currency and their spend and controlling that value. The other areas we spoke about around protecting value in Africa is around Africa's assets, and by that we spoke about intellectual as well as the investment. So not just our natural resources and our minerals, but also protecting those intellectual IP was spoken about earlier as well, but also some of our investment. You think about some of the major initiatives that are happening, and just looking at some of this big transportation, road and train development that's happening across, I guess Russia, China, and others also sponsoring. I think Africa just needs to be aware of the investment dollars coming its way, who they're lending money from, in terms of the debt that they could sort of wear into the future, and how much of those assets and that value they're actually giving away. So that should be a big topic for discussion. Around training and development, that came up very strongly in our table 2, around training and development in technology and STEM and entrepreneurship and innovation and innovative culture. That needs to start with alignment in the education systems across schools as well as universities. We love the idea around a focused mindset on the youth staying in Africa and not needing to go abroad for education and for further tertiary education to be able to get that benefit. But in terms of investing in alliances with international programs, I know Hong Kong University of Science and Technology collaborate with the Kellogg program for MBAs, etc. So could there be a much more tighter collaboration between tertiary and university and education departments and colleges with other global universities to retain their talent and intellectual property in South Africa and Africa. So also we spoke about the alliances around accelerator programs, incubator programs to stay in Africa too. So speaking to some of the big strategics to actually set up some of these hubs, hearing about WeWork and other companies like that, investing in infrastructure to provide that sort of facility. When that space is there, money flows as well and investment will stay. Information inclusion and advocacy, so there's another one we spoke around for the AU 2020. An example of that is around the health sector, for instance, how communication industries can actually enable health applications and services, sharing those best practices or democratizing knowledge and solutions around education and health. So that comes back to getting lower cost around technology and services and internet to everyone. In response to some of the minister's comments raised, we didn't have too much discussion around that because we left it late, but a lot of the topics that impacted the AU 2020 were actually, I guess, applicable to South Africa directly. And the one thing that came up is that we saw some of the infrastructure programs around water and roads, etc. We feel that probably one of the biggest things should be around power and electricity, because without that you can't innovate. Without having access to electricity and power and the basic foundations and building blocks also creates a big issue for innovation.
Thank you.
We're proud of our past, but confident of the future. But if we were to be confident about the future, it means we've got to give the future an opportunity to identify its own future. The past lays the foundation, but the future must be there. The experiences that we respect that they have of the 19th century and the 20th century are not helpful in the 21st century. That's the reality. But then how do we then engage with them to make them understand that we're not here to say we're pushing you away, you don't know. You know. That's why we take pride in the fact that I'm owned by so and so, because it's the role that they played, but we also have to define our own future, unlike the one that they chose for us. And I believe that gradually, as we create these platforms of being able to collaborate with each other, we'll be able to overcome all these challenges that we have. Once we deploy this new catership that we're talking about, that doesn't need in Africa for a new catership that must not be self-centered, that must not look into monopolizing the knowledge that it has, I always say once more that in South Africa we pride ourselves about the fact that we are standing on the shoulders of the women and men that left it all for the betterment of South Africa. That went to school to understand the system, and then having understood how the system works, once they were produced by it, they came back and defeated the same system for the betterment of our lives. But today, all we want to do is to monopolize the knowledge. And I think, as I said, I think we have learned in the past that it doesn't help to be the greatest PhD in your area and other people are not there, they can't even understand what you're talking about, which begins with sharing your story. And through that story, we believe that as you tell the story, others will heal from it, others will learn from it, and you will also learn something because things will change. So there is a need, as you put it also, for the engagement with the diaspora to say, yes, we are seated here. We're not like we've forgotten about you. This is the exposure and the experience that we have in these areas that we're at, and this is how we think we can contribute towards the development of our own Africa, and that requires people talking to each other. If we don't talk to each other, then we're not going to get that. So we really appreciate this opportunity that we get to engage with yourselves, and we want to say one of the things that we had said we have to commit to with President Ramaphosa is the fact that we must start by having an office here to make sure that at least our companies, our people here, including those that come from South Africa and Africa, when they come here, there's a point of entry and liaison that is able to say these are the trends now. Therefore, this is how we can bridge the gap. Of course, you're on okay, sorry, I'm home now. Of course, all of this fourth industrial revolution that we're talking about will never be realized if the cost to communicate is still high. Everybody agrees here that we need to really do something. Somebody was saying, must I pay? Must I not? Who do I pay? And we need to let go of such thinking of being short-term focused and think about the future, because the $20 million that we get now, and then you sell everything that people must bypass, those that can benefit and develop your country, in the next 10 years is nothing, or 5 years. So we've got to be these people that understand what is it that we want to achieve and how to achieve it whilst we make money to make it. Of course, we really have to strengthen the AU. We all agree. We really have to. One of the things that we did, Hugh, okay, firstly, we've been fortunate, I think about 4 of us, we got privileged to be appointed as ministers for our sector. And as we get to engage with the different people that are coming, we're like, guys, we have a responsibility to our presidents. They are all, they have a particular way of thinking. But we can't keep on listening to people who say, these are your solutions, these are the solutions we have for Africa, as if we don't know how to provide solutions. We've got to go to an extent of saying, yes, we have a solution, but what's in it for us? You have great programs, interventions, Microsoft, but what's going to be African about this? Yes, in South Africa, we are assembling Mercedes-Benz, but what's the South African character in the Mercedes-Benz that we're driving? Identifying our own niche in all these global interventions that we work around. So we just decided that we've got to have our own engagements as this, okay, we're not that young, but we're younger than others. So as these young ministers to say, how do you shape the African story so that we take it to the African presidents? And as much as we'll be doing that, if there's no support from yourselves, we will not achieve it, because we do know it takes time.